Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Bernadette Pillar Real Estate Podcast. I'm Mike Gonzalez, your host, alongside, of course, Bernadette Pillar. How are you doing?
I'm good, Mike. How are you today?
Doing great. So this is our second podcast. Super excited. The first one got a lot of good feedback. So I'm really excited about it. So it's good to be back with you. And I know you've been keeping pretty busy. You just got back from one of my favorite places in the country, North Carolina, to see your son, Christopher. How was that, first of all?
Well, thank you, Mike. It was a great opportunity for me. Christopher serves our Army, and I had not been able to visit Fort Bragg for many reasons since he's been there.
Yeah.
He is getting ready to be moved back to Washington State, the JBLM. And so I am so happy that I had the opportunity to visit him before he returns here. And I got to attend my youngest grandchild, Baron, his second birthday, missed his first
Awesome.
birthday due to COVID
Yeah.
and my accident. But yeah, so it was great.
That's
And
great. Well, I'm so
yeah,
glad you got to see Chris. He's just a great guy, and we're so
yeah.
proud of him that he's serving our country.
Well, thank you.
So it's awesome you got to see him. Well, let's
Yeah,
talk a little real estate, shall we? Yeah,
please, yes.
we're doing this new segment that was a great idea of yours. You know, let's educate our customers and the people watching about terms that often come up, and you kind of take for granted when you're in real estate that people know these terms. So we're going to go over three of them before we get to some of our tips on first-time home buying. We're going to talk under contract, earnest money, and contingencies. Let's talk about the term under contract and what that means.
All right. The reason that I feel it's important to discuss is I've been getting a lot of calls on my listings. As you know, we talked about in our last segment, properties are selling really fast. And so when I tell a consumer that I apologize, the property is already under contract, 100% of the time they say, what does that mean? So as a realtor, we take it for granted, we know what that means. But it made me realize not everybody does know what under
Right.
contract really means. So under contract usually means that, or most always means that a house has an offer on it and a seller has accepted the offer. And its status changes to pending. Usually another word that we're going to define are contingencies, but the house will go under contract and be reflected as pending because the seller has accepted the offer, but there might be some contingencies. And while it is waiting to close or moving towards closing, it'll show that it is in a pending status. And as most of us realtors will use the term also under contract. Now, does under contract mean that the house is completely gone? The answer to that is no, yes, or maybe.
Right.
It depends on how it does in those contingencies, which we'll define in a minute. If the house moves forward, if the transaction moves forward smoothly and all the contingencies are worked through, then the house will then go to closing. It will change to a sold status. In the meantime, it stays in the pending status. If a property, for instance, falls out of contract because one of the contingencies hasn't been satisfied, then it will go back active again and may be available for the consumer. So I always will tell a consumer to watch. Regarding one of my own listings, I can generally give them an idea on a timeline to check back with me or have their realtor check back with me. So that is the basic definition of under contract.
Well, thanks for that. And since we talked about it so much, contingencies, let's talk about those because those can vary pretty widely from an inspection to maybe someone has to sell another home in order to qualify. And you've probably seen just about every contingency in your career. Can you kind of define that and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, some fun contingencies actually. So let's first define a contingency. The word contingent means that something has to happen in order for something else to happen. So in real estate, in order to buy the house, a buyer may make an offer contingent, and we'll take the word out when we don't like to use the word in the definition. So a buyer will make an offer, and the offer is set before the seller, excuse me, under certain circumstances. If, for instance, Mr. Seller, I can qualify for financing, then I will buy your house. If I can have a home inspection and the house passes in my term, in my mind, it
Right.
passes inspection, then I will buy your house. If this, then this. That's what a contingency is. Both buyers and sellers can have contingencies. In this market, we have seen the normal contingencies for buyers, for instance, are what you talked about: financing, inspection. In a house that has septic and well, it'll be further contingent on septic and well, which are also inspection contingencies, but they're also separate. It'll also be contingent on title review. It can be contingent on the house has to be rid of a tenant if it has a tenant in it, those type of. Now, what is a seller contingency? Well, we are seeing seller contingencies in this market because it is a seller's market still. We are seeing contingencies such as, I will sell it to a buyer as long as the buyer is willing to give me 30 days of delayed possession. In other words, once we close, I get to stay in it for 30 days or 45 days or whatever. A seller might make a contingency that they get to keep things in the garage for storage until they find a place or until which time they can move it. So we see some different contingencies in this market from sellers as well. Or a seller contingency can be, I will sell it to you as long as I can find another house to buy, because inventory is so low. Sellers are having to do that sometimes. We can go so deep into each and every question, because a buyer will say, then why are you listing it if you haven't found a house to buy? Well, it's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg sometimes, because sellers sometimes need to sell in order to buy because they can't have two mortgages, So that's a whole nother topic for another day. But these are examples of contingencies. This needs to happen in order for this to happen. I need to qualify for financing. Usually you've got an approval letter, but there's more to the financing, right? It has to follow all the way through. If I can follow through with my financing, I will buy. If the house passes inspection, I will buy. So if this happens, that happens.
So that's very clear. What is often not clear, and so many people misconstrue what earnest money is. Sometimes they think it's a down payment, and oftentimes they think you're not going to get it back. So can you describe what earnest money is and really how it's utilized in the whole process?
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Mike. So earnest money is money that you need to come to the table with when you do reach mutual acceptance. Is when you make an offer on a property, seller accepts the offer, all terms and contingencies are agreed upon. You now have mutual acceptance. So we have added another term today, mutual acceptance. When you have mutual acceptance, then earnest money needs to change hands. The buyer needs to release monies to show he or she is in it to win it. In other words, they're putting down essentially
some stake in the game.
Yeah, stake in the game. I mean what I say what I mean. Earnest money amounts range, okay, but of late we are using about 1% or more because of the kind of market we're in. A buyer wants to impress a seller. So 1% of purchase price is usually the minimum these days. I'm not saying that less can be accepted or more can be accepted, but at a minimum, at a standard, we are looking at 1% of the purchase price. So if you make an offer on a $250,000 house, you should be prepared to have at least $2,500 to put down as earnest money. Now, what you said very clearly when you first introduced the term was that people get confused on how that's used and how it applies. Earnest money is not money in addition to the purchase price. It is applied to the purchase price and it comes off of the top. So off of that $250,000 to $2,500 would be immediately credited and the remaining balance would be paid at closing by way of either cash or most often a loan that the buyer procures. Okay. So earnest money goes towards the purchase. Now, what if a buyer walks away due to inspection? Inspection, remember, was one of those contingencies. If a buyer walks away during the time frame, does not miss their deadline, then the earnest money should be immediately released to the buyer, back to the buyer. Okay. Now, I say should because as a 16-year experienced realtor, there are exceptions to every single rule. And in Washington State, especially, earnest money, the return of earnest money has to be agreed upon by the buyer and the seller. So you need to know
Right.
that immediately upon putting up earnest money, your earnest money is at risk. That is something that a buyer can talk to us about, or their realtor if they have their own realtor. It'll get further explained to them. So that is what earnest money is. Did I cover that?
I think that was great. The biggest thing I see a lot of times is, especially a first-time home buyer, and we're going to kind of pivot into that. They get really nervous to give that earnest money because they don't realize it's going to go into an escrow account, and they don't quite understand, is that part of the down payment? And, I'm glad we talked about contingencies, because a lot of times they'll think, if I give this earnest money and walk away from the deal, especially on the front end without knowing about contingencies, what do I do with that earnest money? So I'm glad, I think everything we talked about really explained that well. So I think in particular, a first-time home buyer would be much more educated by just the top three terms that we covered. So, well, let's talk a little bit about first-time home buying. And we've got several questions that I've laid out for you. And I know you're going to kind of cover them collectively. So how do I win as a first-time home buyer? Some mistakes you often see, Bernadette, how much money I should bring to the table, and are there any programs for first-time home buyers?
In this market, specifically, one of the biggest mistakes that first-time home buyers make are not to have enough funds to come to the table. So I'm going to group this all collectively and kind of jump around a little bit. You talked about programs for first-time home buyers, and there is the Washington State Housing Finance Commission First-Time Home Buyer Program, which is wonderful. And I'm a huge advocate of that program, and I've been teaching for WSHFC for many years. And so I'm a big fan of it. However, let's be realistic. In this market, seller's market, when you go to use that program, I'm not saying don't, I'm not saying to give up. I'm just saying be realistic that in this market, it might be a little bit harder for you to get an offer accepted if you are trying to use a zero down program. So just be prepared for that. But again, I'll be the first one to tell you not to give up, right? If it means that's the only way you have to go because you don't have enough funds, then just get in there and let's work on getting you a home. I closed one yesterday with a first-time home buyer program. He did bring in his closing costs though, so it wasn't 100% zero down. He didn't need to come up with a down payment, but he did come to the table with his closing costs. That made him a stronger buyer. But we got her done, and so that was really good news. Okay, another mistake that first-time home buyers make is they choose online lenders. They don't work with local lenders. They sometimes start that before they connect with a realtor. I am a firm believer that you should connect with a realtor, and choosing a realtor is sometimes a mistake that buyers make. And like I said, we could go into a conversation on each one of these answers on its own merit. But let's try not to do that. If our consumers have more detailed questions about the answers, then we can go there. But making mistakes on choosing lenders, choosing the realtors, not having enough funds to come to the table to function as a strong buyer in this market. Another one of the biggest mistakes, let's actually get into the shopping part of it. Another one of the biggest mistakes I have seen my first-time home buyers do over the years is get caught up in the new look, the
Right.
cosmetic looks. For instance, one buyer that one of my agents and I had several years ago, they had 6 home inspections, six different houses before we ended up closing a deal.
Wow.
That is because they were making the initial mistakes of going for the flip
Right.
houses that were on appearance, on the surface, they looked shiny and, cosmetically pretty, but they were not as strong. They didn't have a strong foundation. They weren't what I call, they didn't have good bones, if you will, and they were going for the pretty look rather
Yeah.
than the longevity of it. So that's another one of the biggest mistakes. Getting educated and understanding terms, and that's why I kind of wanted to start this glossary, this terms, because that's another mistake that first-time home buyers make is not understanding what they're doing, the process. So, and that comes with choosing an experienced realtor to help them understand
Yeah.
the process and the
That, that-
steps.
that's so important, to have a good realtor like yourself, and
Well, thank
really choosing. I also believe on the finance side, having that personal touch, because you can go to Lending Tree or some of these outfits and certainly get some good rates or anything, but there's nothing better than to be able to rely on an experienced home mortgage person or broker that you have a personal relationship. I was just talking to my broker who we just refinanced, but it really gives you that personal touch. So I know you've got some great relationships with some people that you can recommend.
Oh, absolutely. I work with a very strong primary lender in town. In fact, we're going to do a podcast one of these days real soon with our primary lender, and he will go over more information in that realm. But one thing that first-time home buyers get caught up on is the actual, they'll choose a lender based on the rate right up front,
Right.
but there's so much more that goes into choosing the loan program. You actually, as a buyer, and I'm going to let Chad, our primary lender, when we have that podcast, let him go into more detail about that. But you actually, as a buyer, may choose a loan program with a higher interest rate because the actual long-term effect in doing so is better for your financial portfolio. Again, that is a whole nother topic, and we'll let Chad
Yeah.
elaborate on that when we get him on the stage. But these are things that buyers need to understand, and that's why working with a seasoned realtor and a seasoned lender, players in the transaction, players in the game, it's very important. I might want to touch on, I might make some consumers upset with me. There's one final mistake that a lot of my first-time home buyers have made over the years. And I'm a mom of 8 grandchildren. And so I want my kids to listen to me, right? I want to
Wow.
be a great
Yeah.
resource for them. But one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of my first-time home buyers make is well, Uncle Guido says this,
Oh,
and
yeah.
Aunt Marjorie says that. And while, believe me, I'm the first one who will,
Everybody's got an Uncle Guido.
yeah,
They
everybody's
know
got an
everything.
opinion, right? And it's important. I want all the consumers, if they're listening out there, I want them to hear me say that I'm a family person, and I really believe in utilizing your resources, including your family members. But they go hand in hand with the true experts, okay? And I'll be the first one to insist on my first-time home buyers calling in their family to see the house that they're considering to choose, right? And
Right.
so that's just hear my two cents on that, is just listen to your family, but also
Yeah. Listen to the
ask your
expert.
family and also listen to the experts, okay? So
That could be the best takeaway from the entire thing, because I'm sure over your career, you've you've probably had to deal with a few, you want to call it annoying might be a little strong word, but at the same time, someone that's in somebody's ear and you're trying to give them great advice and please listen to me. No,
Yeah,
I totally feel you on that one. Are there good contingencies, that really
yeah,
protect,
yeah.
the
Well,
buyer
as
and the
you know,
seller?
right, as a realtor, I believe that most all contingencies, there's exceptions to everything that we
Right,
teach, right? So that's the one thing I should probably start off every podcast by saying just that there are exceptions to everything that
right,
we teach and we say. But there are I believe as a realtor that most contingencies are good contingencies, whether they're for the buyer or for the seller, because they serve their purpose. Um, but there's also easy ways of, like for instance, the financing contingency. Well, we would never want to, as a buyer, make an offer until we're approved, right? And as
right,
a seller, we would not ever want to accept an offer unless the buyer, well, again, there's exceptions. Never say ever, never say never. As a buyer, most always, we don't want to make an offer without being approved. And as a seller, we don't usually ever want to take an offer from a buyer that's not approved. So then why do we have the financing contingency? Well, financing contingency is so much more involved than just getting your pre-approval. It goes into the property, the appraisal is part of the financing contingency. So the house then becomes part of that process,
right,
right? Then you have to take into consideration when you actually zero in on the house, your lender is then going to compare that to, the loan to value, your debt to income ratio
right,
stuff. Well, does one $250,000 house translate the same as another $250,000 house? Not always. As a lender, you have to take into consideration insurance rates. You have to the taxes, and just because a house is for sale at 250 in one area and it
right,
has a monthly taxes of such and such, another one may have a higher tax rate and it may push a buyer over the edge. Do you see what I'm
right.
saying?
Oh
So
yeah,
there's just so many things that come into play, and most always, in this market, a buyer will come with an approval letter, but there's just so much more now to the process. And so you want to retain and keep that contingency that the buyer needs to um, uh, be able to get that loan
right.
processed. There's the job that comes into
Well,
play too. Yeah.
exactly. So, well, that was some
Yeah.
amazing information, Bernadette. I really appreciate it. Anything else you want to get out there before I let you go?
Let's see. Let me look at our notes here. You did touch on how to win as a first-time home buyer,
Yeah, we
and
touched on that.
I think that most people would be able to conclude from our discussion what those things could be. But just in a nutshell, be prepared, get educated, get connected with a good realtor, with a good lender, and have some money. Have some money saved up, unless you absolutely have no choice.
Yeah, that's
And have
really
some money saved up for your closing costs and for a down payment of maybe at least 5%, and even up to 20% to avoid mortgage insurance. Any more questions about all that? We're here always to help. So I
of
hope
course.
that helped everybody
No,
today.
that was awesome. It was great for me to get a refresh on all that stuff. And Bernadette, before I let you go, can you let everybody know your cell number and your email, how they can get directly a hold of you?
Yes, my cell number 509-868-9181. And then also my office number, 509-598-8570.
Right.
Email Bernadette@SpokanePillar.com.
Perfect. And our website address is BernadettePillarRealEstate.com. You can watch that 24 hours a day, get all the properties, and you can get a hold of me at 509-850-4748, Mike@SpokanePillar.com. Well, Bernadette, we always have so much fun and time just flies when
I
we're doing
know.
these. We're always like, we're going to keep it to 5 or 10 minutes, but there's so much great information that we're giving, and I always appreciate your expertise and insight. So, hey, we're going to do another one soon, and we'll keep it coming. I think we need to do a finance one next. So we need to
Yeah.
get Chad on board. So that'll be great. So I think that'll be a great one. So thanks everybody for watching. We really appreciate it. On behalf of Bernadette Pillar Real Estate and Bernadette Pillar herself, I'm Mike Gonzalez. Join us next time for the Bernadette Pillar podcast. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody.